Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aga Khan lecture series, An Evening with the Aga Khan program at MIT for Islamic architecture. My name is Nasser Rabbat, and I'm the Aga Khan professor and the convener of this lecture series. Today, I'm very happy to welcome an old friend, and I didn't mean old friend, but old friend, a friend that I've known for a very long time, Sussan Babaie, a dear and excellent historian of Islamic architecture who is an expert on the Safavid period mostly, and who is now a professor of Islamic and Iranian arts at the Courtauld at the University of London. But her interest over the years has spread out of Iran and sort of like went everywhere in Asia, from Aleppo to Isfahan to China and beyond. And also it had spread sort of like vertically in time. So she started from the 16th century and moved on to the present. A lot of her recent work has focused on contemporary art in Iran and elsewhere in the Islamic world. And that's partly because beside being a historian of art and architecture, she is also a trained graphic designer. And that added to the mix of her interest and perhaps actually justifies this movement down to the present. But another justification for this movement down to present is that Sussan is very much interested in interpretation and ultimately in theorization out of her material. Her focus in those areas of theorizing is on urbanity, on sexuality, on sensory experience of spaces, and on transculturality. This is something that will be the focus of her lecture today, which actually is something that I'm looking forward to, and I'll tell you why in a few seconds. Sussan has published a very interesting book on Isfahan and its palaces. In 2018, the title is Isfahan and its Palaces, Statecraft, Shiaism, and the Architecture of Conviviality in Early Modern Iran. Beautiful borrowing of the word from Al-Andalus. And she has co-authored several books and articles, and she has co-authored 2 books, Slaves of the Shah, New Elite of Safavid Iran in 2004, and with our own Talin Grigor, she is a co-author of Persian Kingship and Architecture, Strategies of Power in Iran from the Achaemenid to the Pahlavis. Sussan was the president of our own organization of historians of Islamic art and architecture from 2017 to 19, and she's the incoming president for the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies. Her talk today is entitled Fischer von Erlach to Banister Fletcher, Writing Islam into the World's Architectural History. She's starting with actually a very interesting question of what if, and the whole notion of actually trying to look for a possible different trajectory of how certain fields of inquiry have developed over time. And her example is looking at that early book of the 18th century of Fischer von Erlach on the history of universal architecture, and how he actually handled looking at the architecture of other cultures and how they appear in his book. And then she compares it to the most famous, if you want, universal architectural history that came out in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, at the height of the colonial moment. And that is Banister Fletcher's father and son's book, A History of Architecture on the Comparative Methods. And Sussan notices the difference in the direction that Fischer von Erlach was proposing, that there are possible multiple trajectories for the development of architecture from antiquity to the present. And of course, by the time we get to the Fletcher book, we are at the height of Europe's assertion of its dominance, and therefore history has to be all somehow teleologically moving in the direction of the European present. And that's how all cultures would be produced and presented. Sussan's move in here reminds me of my favorite statement from a book that is very dear to me, and that's Garth Foden's book, Empire to Commonwealth, Instances of Monotheism in the Ancient World. At a certain point in his book, he concludes that there are roads out of antiquities that do not lead to the Renaissance. The problem is that the way art and architectural history have been shaped in the last 2 centuries, they all lead to the Renaissance, and from the Renaissance, they all lead to the modern moment with its mostly Western manifestation. So Sussan's intervention here, as fictional as it is actually a way for us to rethink the possibility of an architectural history that does not lead to the present dominant discourse on architecture, with modern Western architecture being the norm and everything else or everyone else is trying to imitate. So please help me welcome Sussan. Sorry, we're not going to be able to clap in sort of like very audible way, but welcome, Sussan.
Thank you very much. This was so kind of you, Nasser. I want to thank everyone who has made this happen, is supporting me from behind the scenes, and indeed the students who are going to monitor the Q&A at the end. But above all, I want to really thank Nasser, who has been so incredibly generous in helping me develop this. I shared with Nasser a draft of an article that is impending, actually. It's coming out, this article, Nasser, and has been very, very helpful in leading me in some new ways of thinking. And I want to thank the 2 editors of this special issue of Journal 18, Dipti Khera and Sarah Betzer, who have helped enormously in making the final product. In other words, research, writing, thinking about these thoughts are never done in isolation. It's with the help of friends, and I thank them for that. And thank you, Jose Luis, for supporting this and making everything happen tonight. So what I think Nasser has really set me up very nicely by pointing to the fact that I'm interested in, I start my interest with Fischer von Erlach and his book, but I have in fact come to spend a great deal of time on this subject over the course of these past several years, and it's years, as all research seemed to take some time to mature. This is essentially about bracketing of 2 important moments represented in a historiographic sense, represented by 2 basically picture-rich narratives of the bigger history of architecture, within which Islamic architecture fits rather awkwardly. But I'd like to suggest that that what if scenario has potentialities for us to think about. One of these picture books is the one of the famous book by Fischer von Erlach, published first in 1721 with a very long German title, Entwurf, einer historischen Architektur, which I will leave it as translated roughly as a project for a history of architecture through pictures of various famous buildings from antiquity and foreign peoples. A really interesting way for us to consider thinking about what Fischer von Erlach is suggesting. This was a very first really world history of architecture. to have incorporated samples from peoples beyond Europe as well. The other picture book, or the other picture, I should say, which interests me is coming from the classic history of architecture on the comparative method, which was aimed for the student craftsman and amateur, and that was published in 1896 by Sir Banister Fletcher, and subsequently under the auspices of his son, Banister Fletcher, and had numerous editions until the most recent, much revised and really interesting 2017 edition, which has a fantastic introduction pursuing sort of the trajectories of Fletcher's famous book. Fischer von Erlach's, allow me for 1 second to move this away from my own site. So Fischer von Erlach's book remains at best only a note in passing in histories of world architecture. This is pretty much the case in everything. Even our favorite sort of world architecture books tend to address him only in passing. This is despite the fact that great deal of critical thinking has gone into history of architectural history in recent years, or the past decade or so. Fletcher's history, on the other hand, has enjoyed enormous popularity for over a century and still comes to be revised and sort of celebrated, if you will, even though it is much more critically done. So it has been enormously popular, but also more recently, it has become a kind of a punching bag, if you will, for the critique of the Eurocentrism that is, and its inherent racism that has dominated that book and indeed its offshoots. My interest here lies especially in the contrast that is discernible between Fletcher's infamous tree, which summarizes, encapsulates the basic sort of approach that Fletcher took, and in fact reflects the kinds of historiographies of architecture that had dominated, and that it depends on a massive tree trunk which takes into consideration roots from geology and climate and religion and social issues and history and so forth, and out of which grow these branches on the lower level, as one can see very clearly, which only lead to one conclusion: a Mexican architecture, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese, and so forth, and then rises from Greeks to Romans to Romanesque, and Romanesque, Byzantine, and Saracenic, which is in reference to Islamic, branch out of Roman, and then that's the end of all the others. From there on, major, really fruitful branches of European histories of architecture extend, including, and very importantly, to that of American modernity at the top of the tree. This sort of dominant, infamous tree of architecture has pretty much the entire world embracing traditions of Islam reduced to a Saracenic category, which is, as I think everyone knows, a pejorative designation that was rooted in medieval demonization of Arabs and Muslims. It was introduced, that is, the tree of architecture, as a frontispiece to the 1905 fifth edition. So in other words, it has sort of lives of its own, schematizing, visualizing that Eurocentric archive of knowledge that we know about history of architecture. So from that tree, which is, I refrain from going into details of looking at each part of it, one of the most important issues that emerges is the fact that there is a historical trajectory for all the European traditions which lead to the American modernity. And indeed, there is nothing of that sort for non-Western architecture, that places that are outside of the Western Europe and then its offshoots in America. And that's where, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to move forward yet, but that's where the non-historical styles are introduced. In other words, everything outside of Europe is non-historical. I'll come back to this again. If we look at an alternative, and this is where my alternative comes into play, the alternative is indeed Fischer von Erlach, in which a different model of histories of architecture begin to emerge. In other words, a different route, if you will. So what Fletcher's tree represents are roots, R-O-O-T-S, and Fischer von Erlach seems to represent or present us with an opportunity to look at roots, R-O-U-T-E. So in this instance, and by looking at Fischer von Erlach, I'd like to sort of suggest that what if opportunity or a different perspective possible through the viewfinder of Fischer von Erlach, and to think about genealogy of European architecture as von Erlach represents, or Fischer for short, along with at least a selection of samples of architecture from the expanse of Eurasia, in fact, that is both Western and Eastern Asia, as well as Europe, indeed. And there we find in the book of Fischer von Erlach, representations of the ancient world, as you see in this instance, as well as what he calls the modern world, in which a number of Asian cultural worlds are represented through examples of architecture, from China and Siam to the Arabian Peninsula with Mecca and Medina, to Istanbul and to Esfahan indeed. And then in this book, in addition to the ancient world, the Roman world, which comes before that of the moderns, is also his own designs, that is the architect, the Viennese architect's designs. By the way, just in case, I'm assuming everyone knows Fischer von Erlach, I shouldn't be assuming that. He was the royal architect of the Habsburgs, and really Vienna is unthinkable without Fischer von Erlach in mind, actually. So his was the first architectural history book to have been conceived on a world scale, and in fact benefiting very clearly from the flood of new learning that Europeans had acquired through publications of the travelers' accounts, missionaries' accounts, East India Trading Company accounts, and so forth, during particularly the 17th century and very early 18th century. And he was indeed preeminent architecture of the Habsburg Empire, and his prominence is very well reflected in the way in which a vast bibliography has grown out around studies of Fischer von Erlach. He is the sort of the Baroque architect par excellence in many ways. Whereas out of this book and Fischer von Erlach's proposition, the parts that deal with outside of the European material, in other words, what is the sort of the Asian expanse, if you will, have attracted very little architectural historical studies and largely remain unexplored, with the exception of, for instance, the late Oleg Grobar, who was the first to address the images of Mecca and Medina, at least note them, as it were. And some others, such as Addison Godel, who has written on the Chinese gardens with the help of material from Fischer von Erlach. Here, the book offers us an opportunity, in fact, I think, to excavate beyond those constructs of the long 18th century's colonialisms, that is, coming to the sort of latter part of the 18th century, and indeed its byproduct of Orientalisms. Nasser Rabat has argued, in fact, that, and this is really important to keep in mind, I keep referring to Nasser a few times, that until Said's critique of Orientalism and those related imperial agendas, architectural history had, in fact, very uncritically subscribed to the canonical view. And that continues, it seems, to at least reflect something of the light touch towards Fischer von Erlach's studies. What I see in Fischer's scheme is its potential, in fact, for something of an armature of historical thinking about architecture that would bring into the focus the sort of the wider world perspective. And I see these as potentialities that, had they held sway, the structures of knowledge about architectural history would have developed very differently. It would have had other historical trajectories incorporated of peoples outside of Europe, for instance, and that it would have been as thick and rich a historical thinking as that we have for the European historical developments. So that potential was never realized, as in fact, we all know the rise of European colonial powers produced narrative of history that is exemplified, in fact, by Banister Fletcher's book, and really summarized in that tree that we have briefly looked at. Fischer offers us something of a guide to reroute, if you will, at least imagine what would have been a different approach to architectural history. It is indeed an extraordinary project for its time. It was an Enlightenment period perspective that really projects something of this sort of Enlightenment universalism, if you will. And it was in its own time extremely popular. It was published in 1721 in Vienna, but numerous editions appeared afterwards. And it was the most influential architectural history book of the 18th century. These are not minor issues to keep in mind. In other words, Fischer von Erlach had a major presence in the 18th century. And then it disappears from the scene. So let's just spend a little time, if I may, on what are the constituent parts of his book. It has actually 5 books, the Ancients, then the Romans, so book 1, book 2, Then book 3, which is the moderns, he calls it, and it's a sampling of Asians, including from the Arab world and the Ottoman world all the way to China. And it claims to have Japan, but there's nothing of that sort in the book in terms of images. Then it's book 4, which is the author's own buildings. So in other words, the whole thing is about where he fits as an architect. And then designs of vases and urns, which make the book 5. So in each of these, of the 5 books, one gets a sense that we are not talking about a teleological model of development, even though there is an implicit understanding of Fischer von Erlach wanting his own work to be cast in light of the Romans, essentially. But that kind of a development from the ancients to the modern being exclusively for the Europeans is, for the most part, really hard to discern in this book. And indeed, even though many cultural and architectural histories are excluded, he avoids drawing, it seems, explicit genealogical lines that would connect the ancients or Romans to the monuments of modern Europe. In fact, modern Europe to him is his work, actually, his own designs. So this kind of a variety or a less sort of genealogy of development or teleological aspect where one sees both past and modern applied to Europeans, but also non-Europeans, seem to reflect something of a more expansive worldly embrace than what we have come to expect from European architectural history. So in the first 3 books, we find a perspective of world architecture that is informed mostly by what might be understood as a rationalist Enlightenment position towards civilizations that are comparable. So that's really important, at least partially and tangentially, that are comparable to Europe. So China is a very good example from the point of view also of 18th century rationalist writing about history, that what Fischer does in Entwurf is to map onto this history of architecture a really good representation of Chinese architecture in parallel to what were the current ideas at the time, for instance, about Confucianism as something that is equally secularist and rationalist, if you will, comparable to the emergent philosophies of Enlightenment Europe. In his book 1, he devotes, his book 1 is devoted to the monuments of antiquity and includes the ancient world with references to the Jews. He starts with the Temple of Solomon, and then Egyptians, Syrians, / Babylonians, if you will, Persians and Greeks. And in this context, the inclusion of Persians amongst the ancient monuments is the one that really sort of triggers something of what I think is the capacity for thinking about the antique or the ancients and the moderns beyond Europe in Fischer von Erlach's book. In his second book, which is dedicated to the Romans, he does something else, which is, to my mind, really interesting. And that has to do with the richness of architectural examples that are primarily civic architecture types. So for the Romans, for instance, he adds a lot of bridges, fora, theaters, baths, and so forth There are some temples, but not as numerous in those. So it's a particular architectural or typology of buildings that he seems to be projecting here, which are resonant of his own designs, but also feature the sort of technological and engineering feats in Roman material, like the bridges and triumphal arches and urban layouts and so forth, which then find their parallel in the Asian material, if you will. So the marvels of engineering and design of bridges in Persia and China, in fact, signals something of the way he is constructing this notion of an architectural history on a world scale. The book 3 then jumps into the world of the moderns, as he calls them. And here in 15 plates, this is the part that I'm most interested in. In 15 plates in this book, he depicts buildings of the Arabs and the Turks and the Persians, and then of also of Siamese, Chinese, and Japanese, as he says. What one finds in this book is this construction of categories of the moderns, which seem to be free of the racialist theories that were developing later on in the 18th century, and especially in the 19th century. So Arabs, Turks, Persians, Chinese, Siamese does not carry with it that kind of weight of race as it becomes so important in the decades after. There are major parts of Asia missing, of course. There's nothing about South Asia or Central Asia in this. Nonetheless, the very presence of these moderns who are not European is well worth underscoring, and surprisingly yet to be fully explored in architectural history studies. In this book 3, he encapsulates in his choices of buildings and ensembles the sort of, and their identification captions, a sort of what appears to be an emergent view of the history of Islam and its architectural production, without assigning it such a term as Islamic architecture or Saracenic or Mohammedan, as it becomes later on in art and architectural history. His ethnocentric classification of the peoples of Islam as Arabs, Turks, and Persians, in fact, was in keeping with what was the common approach in, or standard approach in, European knowledge of the peoples of Islam at the time as well. Something that is in, there is bigger discussion to be had about this, but for now, I just leave it for that. For the Arabs, of course, he includes the holy sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina, with extensive notes around 2 pages on this. So it's pretty rich, pointing to various monuments and important sites within each of these enclosures. And the late Oleg Grobar had noted the extraordinary depictions of Mecca and Medina, and indeed the details in such richness as being an important early bird's eye view perspective in European pictorial context. 2 important studies recently, and just a forewarning, at the end of my talk, I'll have a kind of a 2 slides of some important bibliographic material. So I'll come to those later on. So 2 really important studies, recent studies, show the Ottoman sources for the topographic images of the 2 holy cities to come out of, in fact, interestingly, to come out of an Egyptian design, and the Egyptian artist who designed one of these, or both of them, and indeed that becomes a source for an Ottoman painting, which then becomes the source for Fischer von Erlach, and he acknowledges this in his extensive notes on these two images. He then moves his attention to the Ottomans, and there is a great deal of sort of attention given to the Ottoman material. Several folios are dedicated to these fully rendered images of major mosques in Istanbul, but also elsewhere in Pest and Bursa and so forth, with their ground plans as well, as you see in these. These images of the Ottoman mosques are probably the richest body of information, architecturally speaking. They are large, detailed, accurate plans, fully realized perspectival views that together speak to the trained eye of the architect, who really visualizes these axonometric views of the buildings and indicate this whole package indicates that Fischer was indeed a professional sensitive to the clarity and richness of these architectural structures or monuments of the modern Turks. It really speaks to, one, his attention to the Habsburg interest in the Ottomans, on the other hand, as an architect, admiring these works. He actually speaks and writes about, for instance, the significance of these buildings, and points to the genius of Arab design for architecture in reference to one of these Ottoman mosques. Having said all of this, it would be naive to imagine that he was completely open-minded and indeed without any prejudice. But what is so important in these, to my mind, is the fact that the selections are very specific. So for the modern Arabs and the modern Turks, majority, if not entirely, the buildings chosen are of religious nature. So in other words, Islam as an attachment to this. Whereas for the 8 other Asians, the Persians, the Chinese, Siamese, and so forth, the choices tend to be of bridges and palaces and large-scale urban development, in fact. So again, this presents me, at least, with a very important evidence in pictorial terms, in terms of choices of the ways in which Fischer von Erlach makes categories in a way of civic imperial projects, as in Persia, Siam, China, and a more sort of religious project, building projects, as in amongst the Arabs and the Turks. So none of this has really attracted much attention in scholarship, and indeed not in terms of what do these selections mean or indicate to us. In contrast to the Arabs, the Turks, the Chinese, the Siamese, the Persians appear in the book as both the ancients and the moderns, and that's a distinctive aspect of the book about which one perhaps should not make too much of a case, but it does again point to something that gives us a glimpse of the capacity, that sort of the possibility in this book of Fischer von Erlach's of a pre or proto-colonial construct of knowledge in which one could imagine there were ancient Persians just as there were modern Persians. this, in other words, undermines that notion of a progress or a teleological approach to development as we understand it, with the superiority of the Europeans who have histories or historical trajectories, as Nasser has pointed out. In other words, these can be issuing from ancient foundations, just like Europeans do. What really interests me in this instance is the choices that are made, and in fact, the sort of precision in making choices and their relevance to Fischer von Erlach's own context, in that we know from evidence, and for this I particularly owe a great deal to Ebba Koch, who has argued that Fischer von Erlach has been studying Persepolis, or what he calls Cel Menor, although which is the name given by European travelers at the time to the Apodono Palace of Persepolis, but that he very self-consciously references Persepolis in relation to his designs for the Palace of Schönbrunn, and that connection between Persepolis, Isfahan, the palace sort of layout in Peking, and Schönbrunn seem to be really a key part of his choices for these other Asians in that book, book 3 of this picture book. These tantalizing evocations of an imperial seat of rule are indeed what really triggers my thinking about also the inclusion of Isfahan with the Maidan, the public square, the palace of Ali Rapu, and then one of those bridges, the Great Bridge of Allah Ferdi Khan, again, a sampling of these extraordinary architectural projects about which Fischer von Erlach was informed by European travelers. The connections between ancient and modern are, of course, implicit. They're really never articulated by Fischer, and the methodological underpinnings of Entwurf are not really what we hope for, but they are relevant here as they are, in fact, lacking evidence of the sort of Eurocentric approach that would deny others a historical genealogy. So in other words, the presence, even if it is not fully developed, of a historical trajectory here is a significant point about Fischer von Erlach's book. And indeed, the books are distinctive. His approach is distinctive and very different from all those post-Renaissance architectural histories and the 19th century models, which kind of extract from that, like Fletcher's book. But in Fischer von Erlach volumes, one does not see those kinds of traces of a line of progress, but sees something of a kind of a trigger of that in ways that fit the 18th century, other 18th century constructions of cultural histories, including Winkelmann, for instance, of a cultural history of art, which is a different model from the one that we will see later on as well. And like the 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon, who gives a structure of knowledge about the East that includes Chinese, the Mongols, the Persians, and the Ottomans, and has issues about Zoroastrianism and Islam, Erlach as well, von Erlach as well, seems to be informed by similar views of this kind of structure of knowledge, where Eastern history, as David Morgan has said, was just history, relevant, important, and interesting, not an obscure corner of exoticism. So von Erlach, in other words, stakes a claim for his volume's place in that kind of a genealogy of the new methods of knowledge production, and so expands it in ways that we even suggest that he has taken these from most approved historians, original medals, ruins, and curious authentic designs. He references his sources with great care and even uses such techniques as these little trompe-l'oeil approaches to the designs, which you see in many of these images, especially of the Ottoman material, as, for instance, we see these trompe-l'oeil scrolled sort of paper images were applied at the time to botanical studies and scientific studies. In other words, a form of authenticating the way in which the images are presented. It's kind of an ecumenical urge is what seems to be motivated towards the Enlightenment's universalisms and those notions of time in the 18th century, when human perception of time and of the sort of longue durée were temporarily, at least, entwined with a worldview that was sown from a rational basis of knowledge and erudition, something we clearly see lost when we come to the later period. And here, I want to suggest that before the dead branches of history that represent Fletcher's tree of architecture, one can return to or look at Fischer von Erlach's representation as something utterly stunning in the way in which we come to see world architecture without an Islamic category, actually, which is a later construct to begin with, but to have the Arabs, the Turks, the Persians to appear like Egyptians, Chinese, and everybody else in a way. I'm not dismissing the Eurocentric and very personal intentions of Fischer von Erlach, but rather I am particularly interested in the way in which the roots become roots, in other words, pathways towards a different historical thinking and knowledge production that predates the kind of 19th century, late 18th, 19th century development of privileging the European, uniquely European sources of historical development and reach towards the modernity, as it were. My really, ultimately, my point about this is what Nasser has so eloquently talked about as well, which has to do with the production or construction of knowledge. He actually has spotlighted one of the most devastating historiographic consequences of the sort of knowledge that comes out of Fletcher's tree of architecture, where disentanglement of the ancient or the past from the present applied to Islamic architecture in particular seems to be irreversible, where he breaks it into two distinct mega periods, the ancients and then everything that is of the Islamic, and never really meshing these two together. The example in museum displays is striking, in fact, where you have ancient Persians, ancient Egyptians, ancient everybody, and then you enter the Islamic galleries without any particular link drawn between these two sort of mega periods, as it were. So as the 18th century formation of European knowledge would indicate in both images and words, there may have been a possibility to consider for us models of analysis that would be more akin to the image of the dense wood or woods than a single tree of architectural history. And I think Fischer von Erlach's world architecture can trigger a different way of thinking about image of architectural history, and perhaps even about Europe and Eurocentrism in a more generous manner, if I may put it that way, and perhaps help us to fell the tree of architecture, as it were. And thank you very much. I just want to, because I know this will be recorded and you will have access to these, to also give you some of the sort of bibliographic information about both Fletcher and Islamic architecture, just a few samples, the best ones I have been inspired by, and on Fischer von Erlach, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that lecture, Professor Babaie. That was very, very interesting. Particularly fascinated by that wonderful comparison you make, roots to roots. Very, very interesting to learn more about Fischer von Erlach and all of that. We have a question from Kay Rizvi, who is saying, wonderfully interesting talk, Sussan. Von Erlach builds very much on Bernard Picard's book on the customs and rituals of the world, 1721 to 36. There, the Persians in particular are given a, quote, civilization. And so the historical lens in Erlach is not surprising. Picard does not do the same for Arabs or Ottomans. Could you tell us whether you see the same treatment, attention to a deeper history, ancient/modern, for Ottomans, for example?
Yeah, Keshvar, great, thank you. I know, and I have actually referenced this point in the article, which I skipped here in favor of time, and your work on Picard and that frontispiece, which is, as you have noted, represents sort of the leadership, not by way of an Ottoman figure or the Prophet even, but by way of the figure of Ali, the first Shiite Imam. And precisely this kind of a connection. And there is another Picard more on architecture, which is something Dipti Khera is working on, which includes India actually. And in other words, they are all sort of fitting into this model of thinking that is early 18th century, late 17th, early 18th century shared concepts. I don't remember what the Picard one does with the Ottomans, but I think if I understand you, you're saying that the Ottomans aren't included quite as prominently. In other words, it's the Shiite Islam that is foregrounded rather than Sunni Islam of the Ottomans. In the case of Fischer von Erlach, clearly his interest is deep in regards to the Ottomans. I don't know if I answered your question, Keshvar, but anyhow, I'm happy to carry on the discussion at another time as well.
Thank you, Sussan. I want to emphasize that Q&A is open for questions. And while you're thinking about questions, I want to ask a question myself. Sussan, you talked about the advantages of this book and its views through architecture. My question is, are there any drawbacks in his view of architecture that can obfuscate understanding of the word architecture?
Oh, definitely. There are always drawbacks. And it comes with things like you wish he would have added this or that. So yes, of course. And you know, all I'm trying to do is not to, I mean, you can write a critique of Fischer von Erlach and take the dagger to him as best as you want, but the point I'm trying to make is what is useful for us to think about. And in the end, the whole point has to do with a pre-colonial, Orientalist approach that has more complexity embedded in it. It's not totally innocent, but it is less loaded, perhaps, or as yet not fully loaded as it becomes in later periods.
Thank you for that. We have a few more questions. One from Nasser, who says, thank you, Sussan. Can you tell us why the degree of veracity varies from one example to another outside of Europe when we know that Fischer von Erlach did not travel to any of those countries?
Yeah.
Relatedly, he's also asking, do we know anything about who may have been his sources for these images? European travelers, native Islamic people, hired hands?
Yeah, exactly, Nasser. So yeah, he never traveled anywhere, right? So he must have had access to a great library, and that's one of the things that, in fact, Ebba Koch has shown his access to a library, and it would have been great to have, for me, to be able to also check his library, or the library, royal library, to which he might have had access. But we do know some of these images are very directly coming out of European travelers that he has consulted, like Sanson, or the work of the Danish traveler who did a lot of Ottoman material, and of course the Egyptian designer he references directly with regards to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina as being his source. So the Egyptian designer, who then is responsible for the Ottoman painting, and to those he gives credit, actually. So he gives credit. In fact, he lines up all the names of people he has consulted. And that's at least from a scholarly point of view, very admirable, I would say.
Thank you. And there is another question from Michelle Lamprakos, if I'm pronouncing correctly. I wonder if Fischer von Erlach is an example of a wider Enlightenment phenomenon of interest in multiple architectural models and routes. In mid-18th century Spain, for example, reforming Bourbon kings sponsored a project to document Spain's national architecture, in which Arab Islamic period was fully integrated. This only became politicized in the 19th century, but led to different avenues to understanding the country's architectural past. Edward Said himself admitted Spain's relationship with the Orient was different, for example, never completely other.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and thank you for sharing that bit. I'm not at all knowledgeable about that particular period and that particular emphasis on architectural models and thinking about the Islamic history of Spain in mid-18th century. But that makes a good parallel point in terms of those possible alternative ways that during this period, one finds this kind of a pre or proto and pre-Orientalist approach, or lack thereof of the Orientalist approach, still tangible in various places. In fact, what you're pointing to, which is perhaps worth repeating, is the fact that we are understanding the 18th century and Enlightenment age differently now. In other words, there is a recovery of those aspects of the Enlightenment which really precede what becomes the sort of virulent, violent Orientalist approaches of the 19th century, built upon the colonial sort of expansionist projects. So yes, I'm sure that that's part of this landscape, but thank you for sharing that information.
Just on the question of canon and Enlightenment and all of that, I wonder if you could elaborate more perhaps on what this work might mean for the question of influence that we talk about so often in our efforts to globalize or world, so many quotation marks, the canon. Is this interjection, this what if, a way for us to perhaps reassess agency, or are we not there yet? I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So that's really, really interesting and compelling a way to think about it. It occurs to me that all of this is taking place. That's, you know, one piece at a time. It is being addressed by various scholars in the process of rethinking the sort of dominant paradigms. And I think there are methodologies or models of inquiry that are very productive to adopt. And one of them is the sort of thinking about transculturality as an exercise in sublimating. It takes time. It does have a sort of a slow moving process. A conquest doesn't immediately mean everything turns one way or another, but rather it's this negotiated exercises along the way. And it may very well be that cumulative effect of us avoiding or complicating issues about what you said, influence in different locales, in other words, will sort of cumulatively give us something to work with. And I think there is a lot done already on many of these issues, and more to come. There is no one in their right mind would possibly want to choose to use things like influence of the Europeans on anybody anymore. So anyhow, I hope that answers it. It's a big question, and it really, you have to break it down, in my view, into different subjects that you query.
There is another question from Sarah Berahman. Thank you for your great presentation. Do you think that it is possible to compare history, ancient/modern, in different area based on meta-architecture level?
To compare them, I'm not quite sure if I understand your question properly. You mean as in, for instance, ancient and modern of, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Would you mind clarifying? Or do you understand it, Bushra?
No. Okay, if you want to clarify, you can put it in the Q&A question and I read it for Sussan. Meanwhile, I can read the next question by Sibel Voltagan. Is the lack of Orientalist approach in Fischer von Erlach just a matter of pre-Orientalist vs colonial 19th century, or is it also a difference of German perspective vs the British Fletcher? As we know, Said was criticized for not looking at German Orientalism.
Yeah, thank you, Sibel. It's first of all the time difference. I mean, Fletcher, British Empire, everything is seen through the British Empire, lens of British Empire, is a late 19th century, early 20th century. And German speaking, in other words, world of Fischer von Erlach is a very different one. I mean, late 17th century, early 18th century, German Orientalism of the variety that Said was criticized for having ignored is of a much later date as well. If you read, for instance, what Engelbert Kempfer writes about his travels to Persia and Japan, it really syncs with the way Fischer von Erlach is thinking, or others like Adam Oliarius are writing, and not with what one encounters perhaps later in the 19th century. So the difference is quite vast, I think, and it's really, it's useful. What I'm suggesting is that it's useful to not cast all Europeans through the lens of Orientalism, that we need to distinguish between time periods. So what is the validity of that argument of colonial and Orientalist approaches? These periods of Fischer von Erlach and company precede them, and to my mind are well worth thinking about differently.
Thank you for that. I'm also wondering, based off of everything that we've been talking about, and you've mentioned several times that Fischer von Erlach at one point kind of disappears from popular discourse, and that he remains to this day largely under research, understudied, and all of that. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on why you think he's been so maligned, or why was this burying kind of intentional? Was it just happenstance? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good point. I can't really fully answer that, but I can say this. He's not maligned, he's perfectly celebrated. The point about it is that he's celebrated principally for his contributions to European architectural development and history of European architecture. He's not at all really looked at in any depth for a contribution towards world architecture history. There are now some efforts to that end, and he is included in those. It's fashionable now to have world architecture everywhere. And so, you know, Fischer von Erlach, you cannot do world architecture without having at least a paragraph or two about Fischer von Erlach. But not in terms of an analysis of where does it come from? You know, how does this come about? What does it mean? Does it mean anything to his own time, for instance? That part hasn't been studied. I haven't done it either. I don't know what happens in his own time, in other words. with such material as he represents. So yeah, it's just, in my view, from the perspective of world architecture history, he is understudied.
Thank you for that.
Well, with no more questions, thank you very, very much, Sussan, for this wonderful lecture and for entertaining all these questions. I am in the middle of a semester in which I am teaching a course on Orientalism. So you have actually fed our thoughts. Last week, we looked a little bit at the use of Orientalist architecture in 19th century. Perhaps we will revisit the subject now to somehow sort of like wonder about whether one could see that development, that change, and the appropriation, if you want, of Orientalizing elements in architecture of Europe in 19th and 20th century. I am looking very much forward to seeing your article published, but also to what's coming after this article. I'm sure your appetite is not satiated yet about this topic. And I'm sure you are going to go forward. And I'm looking forward to that because we probably will intersect as we move in the space of looking at this architecture.
Yes, so, no, that sounds wonderful. I have to say that I had never been I've never been really attracted to Enlightenment era, and I can't get enough of it now anymore. So it's great. You're right. Absolutely. It's we shall meet again in that
we
space.
shall meet again, inshallah. So
inshallah.
Many thanks, and thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you in future occasion. Wait for us in the spring semester. We will have a very long list of lectures.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and good night to you.
Yes, thank you. It's past midnight.
Yes. Bye.
Bye, everyone.